My greatest fear is not that you will fail, but that you will succeed in doing the wrong thing. These are the words of the late Dr. Howard G. Hendricks. I was a student sitting in his classroom in the mid-1990s when I first heard these words. And it resonated with me and continues to resonate with me to this very day. Dr. Hendricks was concerned for us as future Bible teachers and missionaries and pastors that we will fall into what could be called the paradox of ministry, that we were in danger of failing in the midst of success, or as he put it, that we will succeed in doing the wrong thing. The danger was real and his concern was justified. I couldn't help but think about these words when I continued my study in the Gospel of Mark, particularly in Mark chapter 6, verse 30, when these apostles, or the disciples of Jesus, returned back from a very successful mission trip. For we read in Mark chapter 30 to 32, then the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. He said to them, verse 31, "Come with me privately to an isolated place." Isolated place is actually the wilderness place, and rest for a while. And then Mark parenthetically says these words, "For there were many coming and going, and there was no time to eat." And so they went by themselves in a boat to some remote place or some wilderness place. The disciples were returning from a very successful and very impactful ministry trip. Jesus had sent them out two by two into the mission field, and they had some success. They had extreme success. So much so that they were excited and wanting to return to Jesus in order to report what they had done and what they had taught. But in doing so, Mark gives us clues in the text that these men were in danger of falling into the paradox of ministry, in that they were in danger of failing in the midst of success. In Mark chapter 6, verse 7, Jesus sends them out. As we read in Mark chapter 6, verse 7 again, Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out two by two. And he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. Up to this point, the disciples were mere spectators of our Lord's ministry. They had a front seat to his ministry. They had a front seat to his teaching. They have witnessed what he has done and what he taught to the people. They themselves were recipients of his teaching, but they were nothing more in essence as passive observers. They were quietly observing what he has done and what he had taught, but they were not participants in that ministry. But in Mark chapter 6, verse 7, he sends them out. In other words, that for the first time in their training, they have the opportunity of becoming active participants in the ministry of Jesus, and that he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. One could only imagine for these young men as they went out that there must have been some sense of trepidation. They must have been nervous about going out there without Jesus to do the ministry of Jesus. And Jesus did not send them out as they were. He delegated his authority to them. And they had success. For we read in that same text portion in Mark chapter 6, verse 13, they cast out many demons and anointed many sick people with olive oil and healed them. They had success. Their maiden voyage in ministry was met with reception, accolades, and success. And they came back excited. And they wanted to share with Jesus what they had done and what they had taught. And they came back very excited, full of self-confidence. And what Mark does here, he warns us by leaving us clues in the text about how these men returned. He gives us insight into the attitudes of these young men as they reported back to the Lord, who sent them out and who empowered them to preach and to teach and to take on the demonic powers. And Mark tells us by using some techniques that these men came back with inflated egos and with an excessive sense of self-confidence. They were in danger that in the midst of their success on their first ministry outing, it would ultimately lead to their failure in ministry. Or in the words of Dr. Howard Hendricks, they were in danger of succeeding in doing the wrong thing. Or they were in danger of failing in the midst of success. This is the paradox of ministry. We read again in Mark chapter 6 verse 30, they returned wanting to tell Jesus all that they had done and taught. The return of the disciples to Jesus reveals that he was the source of their authority, and their ministry was in effect an extension of the ministry of Jesus. Having been sent out by Jesus, in Jesus' name and with his authority, their preaching, their healing, their driving out of demons were in effect Jesus' preaching, Jesus' healing, and Jesus' driving out the evil spirits. In the sense that they were given the authority by Jesus to take on the demonic powers of the day. And they came back with an enlarged ego and an overwhelming sense of self-confidence. And what Mark does, he gives us this clue by the way he structured the verse. They wanted to declare everything what they had done and what they had taught. Notice how he writes it. He says, what they had done, it's what they had taught. In other words, the emphasis is on them. There is no mention of Jesus who sends them out. There is no acknowledgement that he's the one who empowered them and he's the one who gave them authority to take on the demonic powers. But rather they came back with a deep sense of self-confidence. It was all about them. It was all about how they made this ministry happen. And they wanted to tell Jesus about it. Mark also gives us another clue by using a specific verb that is translated as reported or report. The word that he uses there is apengelio, which carries with it a nuance of publicly declaring something. In other words, they wanted to report back to Jesus, but to do it publicly. We will notice also that in Mark chapter 6 verse 31, Mark tells us, for there were many coming and going. And what that means is that the men and women that benefited from the ministry of the disciples followed them back to where they were going to meet up with Jesus. And so the disciples returned with a ready-made audience. And so they wanted to report in such a way that those who followed them back would overhear it and then affirm their ministry. In other words, they were in danger of self-promotion. So Jesus is about to teach them a very important lesson about ministry. But for now, they came back full of themselves, overconfident. And the lesson that they would learn and the lesson that we will learn is that overconfidence produces very poor disciples. And so the question that comes to mind is that what is wrong with having a healthy ego? What is wrong with being self-confident. After all, in the world in which we live, people who are self-confident and who displays it excessively get the best jobs. People who have inflated egos are the one who gets promoted. And in the world that we live in is that we have to learn, according to the experts, on how to promote ourselves if you're going to have any form of success. The problem is that the disciples came back with something that was opposite to what Jesus had taught them up to this point. They came back with being full of themselves. They came back with an inflated sense of self-ego, or an inflated ego. Up to this point, Jesus had been teaching them that they could place their confidence in Him. And if they were going to have any form of success in ministry, they had to learn to place their confidence in Him. And so they have gone through this lesson that He must be the source of their ministry. In addition to that, is that if they have a growing sense of confidence in Him, their ministry would be very effective. And the fact that they had success in this ministry was not because of who they were, but it's because of Jesus who's working in and through them. And so they have learned in Mark chapter 4, verse 35 to 41, as says, "Oh, Jesus, still in the storm by the power of His words," the disciples had a crucial question. Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey Him? And Jesus answers that question by telling them and demonstrating to them that He is worthy of their confidence because He is Lord over the elements. And then when they make it to the other side, they are met by a man who is possessed by a multitude of demons. And Jesus, by the power of His word, brings peace to the man by driving out those demons, and the disciples learn that He is Lord over the demonic world. Jesus further answers that question, who is this, by healing a woman who had a disease, a bleeding disorder for more than 12 years. And by grabbing hold of His garment, she was released and relieved from that bleeding condition, and they learned that He was Lord over disease. And then when they made it to Jarius' home, and came to the deathbed of his daughter, that Jesus raised that poor young lady from the dead, and they learned that He is Lord over death. And what Jesus was doing is to teach them that He is worthy of their confidence because He is Lord over the elements, He is Lord over the demonic world, He is Lord over disease, and He's Lord over death. And the way they came back was contrary to what He has taught them. And then they went with Him to His hometown of Nazareth, and there He gave them a demonstration of what unfaith looks like. The hometown folk rejected Jesus because He was nothing more than a boy that grew up, humanly speaking, from their perspective, in and among them. So for them, how could someone with such a normal background be used of God in such a significant way as the promised Messiah? And so when they came back from this very successful mission trip, they were displaying something that was contrary to what Jesus was teaching them up to that point. They came back with an inflated ego and with excessive self-confidence. And the question is, how did Jesus handle this? We see the response of Jesus in Mark chapter 6, verse 31 and 32. And He said to them, "Come by yourselves to a deserted place or a wilderness place and rest for a while." Then comes the parenthetic comments, for there were many coming and going, and they did not have time to eat. And they departed to a wilderness place in the boat by themselves. And the way Jesus dealt with their attitude was not rebuking, but with an invitation. Come to a deserted place by yourselves. He tells us to rest. Of course, it must have been a taxing mission trip. But more than that is that he wanted to remove them from the crowd that was following them. And by removing them from the crowd that returned with them, he neutralized their desire to broadcast and to get publicly affirmed and to be applauded by the crowd that returned with them. And so he isolated them away from the crowd so that he would neutralize the desire to broadcast. Thirdly, Jesus says, come by yourselves to a wilderness place to eat. So to rest, to eat, but ultimately Jesus invites them to leave the crowd behind so that he would neutralize the desire to broadcast their achievements. But then he would teach them a very important lesson about ministry and about discipleship. And Mark gives us clues in the text, particularly by the use of the word a wilderness place. And in the next lesson, we will find out what Jesus taught them and what Jesus is teaching us about ministry. But for now, if we're going to have an impactful ministry, we need to avoid the paradox of ministry, in that we succeed in doing the wrong thing, or we will be in danger of failing in the midst of success. And Jesus takes them out away from the crowd to teach them a lesson in the wilderness place.